Here we go, another episode of the Daily Medieval Podcast with myself. And today we are talking about a kind of more broader topic, you could say, because typically we've talked about unions, about people, succession, abit sujet, all these different things within the medieval era. But today we're talking about medievalism in modern terms, what we mean by medieval history, how it came about, and perceptions of it, which is really interesting because what we have to understand is that on one hand, history is as a subject is really old. The ancient Greeks. I mean, true, they studied philosophy and theology and kind of mathematics, for instance. But within that, there was also an element of history as well. But it wasn't really until the 1800s, quite recently, that medieval history became its own subject, a distinguished subject in universities, which universities are a German import, and it was Germany that kind of kicked off these things. Nevertheless, what we have to understand is in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, medieval history does not really exist. You have ancient history, classical history, Greek, Roman, kind of classics, and you have modern history, which at that time was the 1800s, and then you had history, which was everything in between from about 400 all the way up to 1800. Whereas nowadays, obviously, that period we split between medieval history and early modern history. So, so already by the 1800s, we can see that by the late 1800s, medieval history is not yet a thing. Now, prior, the reason for this, and this is where we kind of get the idea of the Dark Ages, is because essentially before the Renaissance, so before the, let's say, 1300s, 1400s, around about then, kind of it was seen that nothing really happened. There was this period of human stagnation. Rome crumbled, and then you have the discovery of America, and everything in between was kind of this just kind of weird mess of kind of anti-Roman, anti-classical kind of world. But in 1928, a certain book, the Gothic Revival, was published, which kind of really changed things, really. This book essentially created the idea that prior to the Renaissance, there was a Gothic movement. There was a world which was determined by this kind of northern culture, not that of the Romans, but a Germanic culture. However, the author, Clark, was kind of wrong and is seen as being wrong because he took the stance that this was an English movement. He kind of looked at this kind of Gothic revival through an English lens. However, it's been seen, it was revised that it was more of a European movement, that there was this widespread throughout Europe Gothic movement. And if we travel back to the kind of late 1700s, 1770, we see people already touching upon this. One such person is Goethe, 1749 to 1832. He is the kind of father of this kind of European Gothic movement, because he writes in 1770 that there was an architectural movement before the Renaissance. He travelled to Strasbourg, saw the Strasbourg Cathedral, saw that kind of culturally, with it being on the border between France and Germany, Strasbourg has always had issues, whether it was kind of German or France, and yet what we see is this kind of architectural continuity in both France and Germany, that would suggest that once upon a time there was a unified country. Now, obviously, that being the HRE. Now, what we have to understand is at this time, Germany has not yet been formed in kind of a modern sense. It's still, this is before the Prussian unification, and as such, this kind of Germany was fractal. It was a bunch of small states, but they were conscious of the fact that once upon a time they were unified, and Goethe basically was able to show this through the architecture, through Gothic cathedrals, that whether in Bavaria or Munich or Strasbourg, there was this kind of architectural consistency that showed that before the Renaissance there was something here before. And so therefore, so much of modern history is then fueled by this kind of Gothic revival. So as we say, we see in Germany this kind of fascination with the Holy Roman Empire. We then cut to France, and France at this time is building its empire in Africa. And so we see with Chateaubriand, 1768 to 1848, becoming extremely obsessed with early Christianity and the Crusades, and builds a picture of kind of conquest, of nationhood, and a fascination that fuels the French conquest in Africa. And what's really interesting is that we see in the Palace of Versailles, there is rooms full of beautiful artworks depicting scenes from the Crusades, and around them are the coats of arms of noble families who, in this present day, had ancestrally fought in the Crusades. Now, of course, not all of them did, but we actually see over 3,000 forged documents being produced in kind of the late early 1800s to connect aristocratic French families to these crusading nobles, that perhaps your surname was a corruption of, Le Puiset, and or who was a French noble that then went on, so on and so forth. But the idea is, what's really interesting is that, post kind of French Revolution, where we're in this kind of age of rationalism, there is still a fascination and kind of a reaction to kind of return to the past, to before then, this kind of romanticized feeling. We also see that, of course, in Britain. The 1800s Victorian era is obsessed with the Anglo-Saxons. Again, this is a time where Britain is building its empire, and there is kind of a racial undertone, really, that the British were God's chosen people, and a way to rationalize this was through Alfred the Great, the Anglo-Saxons, and the repulsion of the Vikings, because it was seen that obviously Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons were God's chosen people to defend the nation. And so we see a really interesting concept, which is that Alfred gathers the name the Great long after he's dead. Typically with the other greats, there aren't that many. I believe only maybe 7 or so. Peter the Great, for instance, Catherine the Great. These people got the Greats a decade or so after they died, whereas Alfred was hundreds of years after. And the reason was because there was this nationalistic fascination within England about the Anglo-Saxon era, because of this empire. And so we see, to recap, we have Britain, France, Germany, all being obsessed with this Gothic revival, because of the fact that it evokes kind of so much kind of about the time period, really, which is kind of all links to this idea of Romanticism. Again, we have to understand that this is kind of the era of science, of rationalism. We have, the kind of French Revolution and the other revolutions after it. We have the Napoleonic Wars. We have Congress of Vienna. All these different aspects which are kind of creating the modern world, especially, of course, industrialization, which for some, typically nobles and high-born people, is quite scary. So by returning to the medieval era, they're kind of returning to this romanticized fantasy. They're kind of reacting to the industrialization by returning to kind of this feudal society where everything happened in such a different way, which is really interesting. And there are kind of, when we look at Romanticism, a lot of people will argue that that the French Revolution was the cause of kind of this medieval revival, but there are plenty of texts, such as that of Rousseau, published before the Revolution, and this is why we then understand it to be a reaction to industrialization, to social mobility, societal disconnect, and this kind of return to the medieval. And we see nobles, for instance, Horace Walpole, very famous person, 1755, builds a Gothic house with a medieval aesthetic. And he describes the medieval aesthetic as Gloomth, Gloomth. This Gloomth aesthetic is the combination of warm but dark. And that's kind of a very typical, when we think of Gothic, you think of kind of like Frankenstein, I guess, castles, dark, gloomy. And so we see kind of, again, this is the early stages of that. And then we cut to the very extremely famous, one of the most famous authors in the world, Walter Scott, 1771, 1832. He is, I guess, the father of the medieval world in literature, because he is also within this reaction to industrialization. And when we see in his text Ivanhoe, produced in 1880s, not the 1880s, sometime during his life anyways, it was about post-conquest England, nevertheless. Now, there's no truth about it, but it has resonated ever since, even in academia. There's been a couple of movies named Ivanhoe, and you will always find, when there is some sort of academic conference about post-conquest England, that someone will touch upon the kind of themes that are presented in Ivanhoe. And so again, it just shows this kind of longevity from Walter Scott in the kind of the world of literature. But we see that as much as Walter Scott has built this kind of medieval world within literature, that architecture equally follows suit. Now we see Charles Barry, he was the go-to medieval architect in the 1800s. And we see some brilliant examples of his architecture. One of the most prominent examples being that of UK Parliament, Big Ben. There was a fire around the 1800s within Parliament where they were burning medieval tally sticks that would have been receipts for monetary exchanges. The fire got out of control, which then prompted kind of a reconstruction. And Charles Barry then used this medieval fantasy to construct a kind of medieval-esque Gothic building. We also see the same thing also constructed by Charles Barry in the Downton Abbey house. That is based on a actual house. I can't quite remember the name. Nevertheless, again, Charles Barry built it in a medieval style. Although Victorian, it doesn't resonate with a lot of other Victorian houses. And so we see the 1800s is where it really takes off, this idea of kind of the medieval era. And the 1800s also saw kind of the adoption of medieval chivalry and honor. We see that this kind of idea of I called it sex, drugs, and rock and roll of kind of the 1700s was replaced by the concept of the English gentleman, based on the medieval knight. And funnily enough, in 1839, a medieval tournament was actually held along the borders of Scotland, whereby nobles, were invited to dress in medieval costume to joust and take part in the tournament in medieval fighting, and we also see then in religion, confession, penance, and fasting begin to come back into Christianity. And so, although there's like a literary tradition, an architectural tradition, we also see in kind of the societal discourse a kind of adoption of medieval chivalry and medieval aspects. And we also see this at all levels of society. Queen Victoria herself was often painted in medieval costume, wearing the same sort of outfits as a medieval queen would. And of Prince Albert buried in the kind of a similar way as a medieval knight is. But then, of course, we come to the fathers of medieval history, that being Stubbs, Freeman, and Stenton. And the rest is, funnily enough, history, because this is where in England, in the UK, that kind of medieval history becomes its own distinguished field of study. What's really interesting is that because it is so new, in a sense, be it only 150 years or so, you can trace back your what's known as your Stubbs number. If you went to university in the UK and you studied medieval history, you can trace a lineage back to Stubbs. Now, my Stubbs number is is either 5 or 6, in that my mentor was taught by someone who was taught by someone who was taught by someone who was taught by Stubbs himself. Now, everyone has this if you were taught in the UK, and this is something almost unique to medieval history, because I've heard of similar things in maths, that there's a certain mathematician that did so many collaborations in the last about 100 years ago that you also have a number of lineage to that person. But it's really interesting that because medieval history is so new in that sense, that we can trace that back, and it's something very quite special, and I think that's kind of the aspect of history that is why most people get into it, really, is that typically there is a mentor, a lecturer, a teacher who inspires them. I, for one, got into medieval history because, I think it's the most vibrant part of history. So many people say that it is so incredibly boring, that it's useless, but, when we look at history itself, classical history, very vague, over quite a few 100 years, whatever. Early modern history, probably between, let's say, 1500-ish up to the 1800s. So only 300 years, very small part of history. Modern history then, 1800 up to modern day, again, only 200 years or so. Medieval history, on the other hand, let's say fall of the Roman Empire, about around the 400s, late 400s, all the way up to the discovery of America in 1500, it's 1,000 years. In terms of history, medieval history is one of the largest periods, unless you're looking at, let's say, the ancient Egyptians, where you have the Old and the New Kingdom, that's about 4,000 years in total. But aside from that, medieval history is one of the largest periods in human history, and it's so incredibly vibrant. There are some absolutely beautiful medieval texts, medieval manuscripts. There is beautiful architecture. You have all of the hallmarks of a absolutely brilliant story. You have romance, war, conquest, love, sex, gossip, um, intrigue, murder. All of this is contained in the medieval era that so many people are unaware of. And, when we look at popular culture, there's such a rehashing of so many stories, such as, be it the Vikings or even the First Crusade, or kind of the Norman, the kind of English kings, etc., etc. That so many extremely interesting stories and events are missed out, and people, sadly, with the way that teaching occurred for so long, were turned off by history through just learning dates after dates after dates, which killed it for them. Which is why we have to, as historians, re-energize and reinvigorate people to get into medieval history, because it is so important. And it's so ignorant not to be interested in it, because it has impacted the world. It's shaped the world. The Roman Empire fell, and the medieval era is basically a narrative of social mobility, of people putting their mark on this earth, of building a new society, new ways of doing things, new governments, conquest, trying to make a name for themselves, and setting up the new world as we know it. So thank you very much. I do hope you enjoyed that kind of overview of medieval history. Fascinating topic to delve into, and a topic that is actually quite open for scholarship, because quite often we talk about kind of the medieval era, knowing that to kind of access it you need to know Latin, or another language. Whereas looking at kind of modern medievalism, i.e. the 17th century perceptions of the Crusades, or 18th century perceptions of the Anglo-Saxon era, is a way to study the medieval era without knowing those languages, which can make it far more accessible for some people. And it's still a very interesting topic, seeing how kind of the empire building of France ties into the Crusades of the Frankish and this rediscovery of what it means to be French, which is fascinating stuff. So there you have it. Join us next week for whatever it may be, and enjoy yourselves. I'll see you later.